The event began at Valdir Academy during the graduation ceremony held in the Academy's grand building under the clear sky. At that ceremony, an outstanding graduate named Michael Foxon was called forward to receive his diploma. Upon stepping onto the podium, Michael greeted everyone present and introduced himself as a second-year graduate of Valdir Academy. From afar, a young man was lying on a tree branch, watching Michael with a mocking smile, remembering how Michael used to stumble over even the simplest greetings. He kept observing Michael's appearance from a distance, comparing his distinctive white hair to a moving ball of cotton. Meanwhile, Michael continued his speech, expressing his gratitude for the 3 years he had spent at the academy, considering them the most important of his life. The young man smiled mysteriously, reflecting on the many events that had occurred during those years. He expressed how difficult it had been to remain a side character next to the main protagonist, but now that his main mission had been peacefully completed, he could bid farewell to that harsh life and live his own comfortable and ordinary one. But he was soon surprised when he heard Michael mention his name, stating that he wouldn't have reached this moment without his mentor and guide, Chris, leaving Chris bewildered and confused. Michael turned toward the sky and continued his speech, thanking him and saying he wouldn't have become who he was without meeting this person. Chris, still perplexed, became even more astonished when Michael went on to thank him for never abandoning him, despite his weakness and poor condition, and for always supporting him. Michael didn't stop there. He asked his former mentor to give him a chance to repay the favor and allow him to stay by his side. Michael declared with sincerity and determination that he would follow him for the rest of his life, which greatly surprised Chris. Then, noise filled the place in objection to Michael's decision, as Chris realized that many explorers had indeed been trying to recruit Michael into their teams due to his exceptional abilities. At that moment, several of Michael's peers who had also trained under Professor Chris stood up, declaring their support and decision to join him as well. They were followed by another group of students, explaining that their shared goal was to follow their former teacher, Chris Dutton. Thus, 5 of Chris's former students pledged their full loyalty to him, leaving him in a state of shock and unable to comprehend what was happening. Chris began to feel overwhelmed and questioned to himself the nature of the current situation and how he had ended up in this bizarre position. Panic and dread overtook him, and he screamed internally that he was merely a forgotten side character, nothing more, wondering whether he had ruined the role of the character. Then Chris's memory flashed back to the time before he became a teacher at Valdir Academy, specifically to a horrific car accident he had experienced in his previous life. While lying on the ground drenched in his own blood, he recalled a strange message appearing before his eyes as his consciousness began to fade. The message appeared in the form of a main mission titled, "A New Life for Something." The message asked whether he wanted to accept the mission or not, making Chris wonder in fear if he was really about to die at that moment. But when the word live appeared, Chris felt a force push him toward making a decision to accept. In that moment, he decided with strength and desire that he wanted to live and didn't want to die in that place or time. With his growing desire to live, Chris confirmed his decision to choose a new life, no matter what it was. Without hesitation, he pressed the accept button visible before him to begin his new journey. At that point, Chris awoke from his dream in a completely different place, where a woman in formal attire welcomed him, saying that he had finally woken up. Chris realized that she couldn't see the message window he was seeing, and he was stunned when she called him by his new name. The staff member handed him an ID card bearing his new name, Chris Dutton, and from there, his new life officially began. And so, our protagonist Chris received his identification card, where the name Chris Dutton was written as the new teacher at Valdir Academy. Chris was surprised at his ability to read the card clearly, even though it wasn't written in Japanese. The Academy staff member told him that today was supposed to be his first day, but the welcoming ceremony had already ended. He had missed it due to a train accident, but the Academy would certainly understand his absence. Panic gripped Chris, and he asked for a mirror to check his new appearance, still unable to believe what was happening. At that moment, a message appeared in a mysterious window, stating that he had been reincarnated as a new teacher at Valdir Academy as part of a main mission. The message went on to explain that he had to spend the next 3 years completing tasks under the name Chris Dutton. Chris began to recall that Valdir Academy was part of a fantasy novel he used to read for fun in his previous life. He remembered the story was about a weak protagonist who gained immense magical powers, dominated the world, and got everything, which made him scoff at the absurdity of his current situation. However, he had forgotten many details about the story and couldn't remember exactly who Chris Dutton was. Suddenly, a new message window appeared, informing him that a teacher must have students, and that he had only 24 hours to reach the main gate of Valdir Academy, or the penalty would be death. This threat terrified him, and he started screaming, overwhelmed by the realization that he might die again if he failed, to the point where the staff member next to him thought he had gone insane. After leaving the clinic early, the place where he had awakened, he admitted that he still felt pain. While walking through the city, he began complaining about his extremely poor financial situation, having lost half his savings at the clinic. He remembered the moment when the nurse demanded a very large sum of money for his treatment. As he walked, he finally understood that the currency used here was gold, and that the academy was a half-day's walk away. But he was still confused about the true identity of this Chris character. Nevertheless, he felt a strong urge to try opening a personal status window, just like in the video games he was used to. A window appeared before him showing his new stats, which were both hilarious and disheartening. He was labeled a reclusive mage, with decent power, the agility of a snail, and defense as weak as paper. But the real shock came when a message popped up stating that he was an illegal player and could not use any magical skills. He quickly realized that all those stats were meaningless if he couldn't actually use magic. He began shouting at himself sarcastically, wondering if he had been reincarnated into a pirated version of the world, drawing the attention of passers-by. Things only got worse when he realized that only monsters in this world were unable to use magic, and he was struck by fear at the idea of being a teacher at the most prestigious academy on the continent. This wasn't just a problem anymore. It was practically a death sentence. He began to worry that he might be caught, accused of being a monster, and executed for his inability to use magic, imagining his last words as a desperate defense before an angry crowd. Then he remembered the countdown window, reminding him of the time left, which only increased his anxiety. In a moment of despair, he decided there was no time to break down and chose to focus on the second chance he'd been given in this new life. He told himself that he had some luck. He had been described as a reclusive mage and had experience playing similar roles before. He regained confidence, recalling how he was once praised for his performance in an online role-playing game. Chris decided that over the next 3 years, he would try to survive by pretending to be a mysterious and powerful mage, hiding his true strength. He finally arrived at the academy building, only to find a stone statue that complained the welcoming ceremony had ended a week ago, and there was no one left in the place. Then the statue began to sense someone mysterious approaching, and it started wondering about the identity of this individual coming closer. It felt an overwhelming awe due to the immense magical power radiating from that person, and recalled that a new teacher had been in a train accident on his way to the academy, sparking its curiosity and confusion. But it noticed that this went beyond ordinary power. A clear scar on the person's forehead hinted at a dark and dangerous past. It soon became clear that the person was Chris Dutton, with jet black hair like the mane of a wild beast, pale skin like moonlight, and eyes deep as midnight. The aura surrounding Chris was so intense that the statue considered him the embodiment of death in human form. Chris's black and red eyes reflected the immense emptiness he carried and the many endings he had witnessed. Chris stopped in front of the stone statue and addressed it with disdain, saying that the presence of a mere pebble like it at the academy's gate was an insult to the place. The statue demanded sharply that he state his name and purpose for being there. Chris responded confidently, declaring that he was the new teacher, Chris Dutton, and ordered the statue to open the gate immediately. As soon as he passed through the gate, he moved out of sight and collapsed from exhaustion and pain due to his injury, admitting to himself how difficult his situation really was. Nevertheless, he felt some relief for arriving on time and avoiding imminent death. Chris began to feel that the character he was playing actually seemed somewhat cool. He decided to name this persona he was role-playing as the overpowered teacher with zero motivation, a man who appeared lazy, but was in fact a seasoned and powerful warrior, the type of character who could give sharp, inspiring advice to the story's main hero. Chris recalled that in this character's backstory, he had lost someone dear to him due to a personal mistake, which led to his complete breakdown, until the academy headmaster appeared and saved him. Chris realized that the most important point in this character's background was that he was traumatized and refused to accept new students. He thought about how this teacher would deal with potential students, pretending to be arrogant and claiming that the students were too weak to be worthy of his teaching. Chris felt this idea fit well, and decided he would tell the students that if they wanted to witness his magic, they'd have to become stronger first. Suddenly, Chris noticed blood on his hand, which alarmed him greatly. He felt dizzy and in intense pain when he realized the wound from the accident had reopened. At the same time, a message appeared informing him that he had received the academy map as a reward, which made him furious, as he wished for something that could help him heal instead of a map. Chris felt helpless, unable to make it to the infirmary in his current state. At that moment, a student approached him with concern, asking if he was all right. The student noticed the bleeding from Chris's forehead and began to worry about him, while Chris spotted a strange mark covering the student's cheek. Chris realized that this student was Michael Foxon, the original protagonist of the novel, who bore a cursed power. Chris noticed that Michael hadn't awakened his powers yet. His hair was still brown, and he didn't seem strong at all, just a nervous and confused student. So Chris decided to continue with his plan, pretending to be the indifferent teacher who didn't care much about his students. He sharply questioned Michael, asking why he was outside the classroom during lesson time. Michael became extremely nervous and tried to explain that he couldn't keep up with the class, and that his previous teacher had banned him from returning to the training grounds. Chris began looking at Michael, realizing the reason behind his weak standing among the other students. At the moment, all he could do was cast a simple fireball. Still, Chris felt irritated by the way Michael's former teacher had treated him, believing there was no justification for treating a student so poorly. Chris was surprised when Michael suddenly apologized and looked like he was about to cry, even though Chris hadn't meant his words for him specifically. Feeling awkward about the situation, Chris asked Michael impatiently which class he belonged to, as he needed to return him quickly before things got worse. At that moment, a new mission window appeared in front of Chris, telling him he had to reach the classroom and begin his first lesson as the new homeroom teacher of Class X within less than 10 minutes, or else face death. Despite having the map, Chris still felt unsure of the correct direction to the classroom, but he assumed that this had to be Class X, based on the overall context of events. On the other hand, Michael nervously explained that he was a student from Class 10, so Chris asked him to lead the way. Michael agreed reluctantly, pleading for mercy, but Chris responded in a threatening tone, ordering him to move ahead without delay. Michael replied with fear and confusion that he understood. Chris finally arrived at Class X, feeling utterly exhausted from having carried Michael the whole way and could barely hide the pain on his face. Michael couldn't bear the fatigue and collapsed to the floor upon arrival, crying out in exhaustion. His classmates mocked him for his loud and exaggerated entrance, advising him to sit down without causing any more commotion. As Chris entered the classroom, the students looked at him in shock and confusion due to his strange appearance. Chris stood before the students with an expression of contempt and disgust, describing all of them as trash and harshly criticizing the academy headmaster, Valdir, for the quality of the students he was expected to teach. The students began whispering in confusion, questioning who this man was and why he looked so unsettling, with a visible wound on his head. A student named Nika Toot raised his hand confidently and asked Chris who he was and whether he was even allowed to be here, as Nika was the top student in the class. Chris answered calmly and confidently that he was Chris Dutton, prompting Nika to immediately recall that he was the new teacher who had been in an accident that delayed and injured him. Suddenly, Chris told Nika to be quiet in a cold, sharp tone. Internally, Chris felt embarrassed by the poor timing of his entrance and secretly wished it would be overlooked. He then realized he had to start the lesson in order to fulfill the mission objective, but he was discouraged because he didn't have the usual foreknowledge that characters in reincarnation stories typically possess. He picked up a piece of chalk, telling himself he had no other option but to begin. Chris stepped forward decisively, ready to do something unexpected. He wrote on the board with power and resolve, self-study, deciding internally to stick to his plan no matter what it cost. The students were shocked and stunned by Chris's decision to make the first lesson a self-study session and began to question whether this was really serious. Despite feeling deeply embarrassed inside by his strange decision, Chris chose to act boldly and keep up the role he had crafted for himself. Suddenly, Chris made a very strange move. He pretended to fall asleep, acting as if the students weren't even worth the effort of explaining things to them, leaving them in absolute shock and disbelief. Chris smiled inwardly, feeling deeply satisfied with his performance, wondering sarcastically to himself if what he'd just done could be considered a real lesson. But suddenly, an angry voice cut in, scolding him harshly and demanding that he stop this foolish act immediately, sending a wave of fear and anxiety through Chris as he wondered who the voice belonged to. A girl named Angelina Sharif, a potential heroine candidate, stood up and shouted at Chris angrily for not showing up to the opening ceremony and for disgracing the reputation of Valdir Academy. Chris immediately recognized who she was. She was known by the title The Ice Princess. On the surface, Angelina appeared to be a noble character, the daughter of a duke, and she openly declared her absolute rejection of what was happening before her. At the same time, the students began feeling upset and confused by Chris's disrespectful attitude, especially since most of them were nobles. Although Chris realized his behavior might cause future problems, he chose to continue pretending to be strict and cold. Even though he knew about Angelina's tragic past, he felt that now was not the moment to show sympathy. Chris coldly told Angelina that if she was unhappy being in his class, she was free to leave, leaving her completely stunned. He repeated himself more bluntly, telling her to go if she wasn't satisfied, though inwardly he wished he could apologize. Angelina, shocked, asked what Chris had just said. Chris repeated his words again with clear anger, stating that he wouldn't say it a third time, and told her to leave if she didn't like his class. As the students silently apologized to her in their minds, Angelina replied angrily that she didn't want to learn anything from someone like him. She added that he wouldn't be able to keep up with the lessons anyway, and that she wouldn't waste her time with a worthless teacher. Right after that, Angelina left the classroom amidst the whispers of surprised and anxious students. At that moment, Chris thought to himself that he had expected something like this. All the students were proud nobles, and he wondered how many would actually remain with him in the end. He began to worry that he might lose his job due to his actions, and his only hope was for the academy headmaster to support him. Then a message appeared on the screen in front of Chris, telling him he had succeeded in the mission and received the academy map and a monkey medal as a reward, giving him some temporary relief. Looking around the classroom, Chris noticed that only half of the students remained, the main characters, such as the protagonist and the top-ranking students. Chris began to identify the remaining students, who included potential heroine candidates surrounding the protagonist Michael, like Dulcie with her red hair, and Belle, who had healing powers. He decided to delay introducing another character who wasn't present yet and instead prepared to act like a real teacher and deliver a wise piece of advice. Chris confidently told the students that learning magic with only half effort would lead to death. He explained that Valdir Academy was, in truth, nothing more than a training ground for killers. The remaining students were stunned and terrified by Chris's sudden and blunt statement. Chris continued, warning them about the danger of wielding deadly weapons while lacking proper control over their magical power, emphasizing that so-called accidents were just a cover for a much darker reality. He asked the students in a serious tone if they were truly ready to shoulder that heavy responsibility. The students fell completely silent after those shocking words, and silence spread throughout the entire classroom. Chris turned and left the classroom, feeling satisfied that his plan to leave a strong impression had worked. Meanwhile, Michael remained silent, clearly showing signs of worry and deep thought about what had just been said. In the end, Chris stepped outside the building, laughing loudly, feeling an immense sense of relief after surviving such a stressful situation. Chris began to feel like his life had been shortened by 10 years due to the overwhelming stress of role-playing a character whose entire existence now depended solely on his performance. He decided he needed to quickly adapt to the reality he was living in. Then he remembered the keychain he received as a reward and wondered curiously what its effect might be. When Chris saw the monkey-shaped keychain, he was very impressed and described it as absolutely amazing. He really liked the keychain, but hesitated to wear it, afraid it might ruin the serious image he was trying to project with his character. Then a mysterious message appeared before him, asking him to confirm wearing the keychain, with a warning that it couldn't be removed for 5 minutes after equipping. After some hesitation, Chris decided to try it out and see the effect for himself. Once he wore the keychain, a window popped up informing him that his agility had increased by 1 grade, from F to E, which made him feel overjoyed, calling it a total cheat item. Chris figured that as long as he kept it hidden under his clothes, it wouldn't affect his appearance, and he was happy to gain a new trait that would help him dodge better. But soon, another message appeared, explaining a strange side effect of the keychain. Every sentence he spoke would now automatically end with the word Kai, which surprised and confused him deeply. Chris panicked as he noticed this bizarre effect, shouting in frustration and disbelief, wondering if the game was implying he was a monkey, and insisting that his character should never talk like that. At that moment, Angelina appeared behind him, surprised by his behavior, and hesitantly asked if he was Professor Chris. Chris turned to her calmly, questioning why she was in this place. Angelina regretted not using a concealment spell, especially now that she had been caught while smoking a cigarette. She froze on the spot after seeing Chris's piercing gaze, realizing he wouldn't accept any excuses. Not even the noble name Sharif would save her. Chris, meanwhile, instantly remembered the type of person Angelina represented, the arrogant genius who trusted only in her power and ignored others. Angelina, on her side, felt that Chris's condescending gaze reminded her of many painful experiences from her past, and it wore her down emotionally. Chris suddenly went silent and began to approach her slowly, which made her extremely nervous, thinking he might search her or prevent her from escaping. Feeling pressured, Angelina immediately confessed that she had been smoking and accepted any punishment he would decide for her. She thought to herself that it was better for Chris to be the one who discovered her because he wouldn't let her brush off the mistake, even if it harmed her reputation. Deep down, she hoped Chris would decide that she wasn't fit to carry responsibility, so she could finally be rejected and freed from the burdens she carried. But Chris surprised her by gently touching her forehead and calling her a pitiful little girl, with the word Kai still tacked onto the end of his sentence due to the keychain's effect. Angelina was utterly confused by his words and asked in disbelief what he meant by that. At that moment, Chris felt a deep empathy toward her, recognizing someone else trying to hide their pain behind reckless actions. He remembered himself holding someone in sorrow and deep regret, reassuring himself that no matter how strong he became, he could never change the past or erase his guilt. Angelina was deeply moved by Chris's human treatment of her, and it stirred emotions in her that felt entirely different. At that point, Angelina noticed Chris's keychain and figured that deep down, the teacher must be very different from his outer appearance. He must have received that keychain from someone dear to him. She sincerely apologized to Chris in her heart for stirring up his past pain and for her reckless, childish behavior. Meanwhile, Chris was wondering in confusion whether she had noticed the strange speech pattern caused by the keychain's effect. In the end, Angelina returned to the classroom, which made her classmate Belle feel confused. Angelina vaguely told her she was just wondering about a few things related to Professor Chris, without explaining further what had happened. The class began with Nika Tootie feeling excited that Class X now had only 5 students. Himself, Michael, Dulcie, Belle, and Angelina, calling the group a brilliant elite unit. At that moment, Dulcie sarcastically told Chris that the other students had requested transfers out of the class, and she wanted to prove their strength to those she called useless nobodies. Dulcie was playfully teasing Michael, which embarrassed him slightly, something Chris noticed and mentally commented on, joking that Dulcie was the little devil type of heroine. Belle then stepped in to scold Dulcie and asked Michael to focus on the lesson, before turning to Chris and asking what they would be doing in class today. Chris hesitated but realized he had no choice. This time, he had to give them a real lesson. He then announced seriously that today's class would be a field training exercise. A message from the game system appeared before Chris, stating that the mission required Class X to head to the Venet's plains and defeat 50 monsters within 24 hours. The scene immediately shifted to the beautiful natural setting of the Venet's plains. Suddenly, a massive magic circle appeared, stunning everyone and signaling the beginning of the teleportation. The students were amazed when they were transported magically to the site and couldn't hide their admiration for the incredible technique Chris had used. Nika excitedly praised Chris's ability to use spatial magic even before they had received their training weapons. But the truth was, Chris wasn't responsible for the sudden teleportation, and he began to feel confused. Just moments ago, they were in the classroom, and now they were in the plains. Dulcie noticed something odd and pointed to a mysterious shadow above Professor Chris's head, questioning how such high-level magic had occurred, as none of the students were capable of it. Chris immediately understood that they had been summoned by an unknown party, and a sense of danger washed over him as he grasped that fact. Suddenly, a terrifying giant monster appeared, a horned rabbit, and a message popped up confirming that they had been teleported by a third, unidentified entity. Dulcie and Angelina screamed, warning Chris about the enormous beast that had emerged directly behind him. Chris was terrified and internally questioned whether he was going to die in this deadly situation, especially with 50 monsters left to defeat. He looked toward the massive beasts as they approached him menacingly. But Chris quickly regained his composure and reminded himself that he was playing the role of Chris Dutton, the strong character, and asked himself what the real Chris would do in a moment like this. He realized that Chris Dutton would treat this situation as nothing more than a simple training session for his students, using it to test their abilities. Suddenly, Chris shouted at the students, asking if they had forgotten the reason they were there, trying to motivate them to fight. Angelina objected, saying it was madness to train in such a dangerous situation, but Nika quickly caught on to what Chris was implying. Nika enthusiastically explained that, of course, Professor Chris would take on the giant monster himself, and the students only needed to deal with the smaller ones. Chris felt relieved that Nika had perfectly interpreted his actions, while Angelina felt frustrated that her role was reduced to fighting smaller creatures. Angelina decided to place her trust in Chris and began preparing a powerful offensive spell, believing he had a solid plan and wouldn't put them in danger without reason. She launched her ice spear spell with all her strength and bravely charged forward to fight the smaller monsters. Belle excitedly declared that she would take care of support and begin healing any injured teammates immediately. Michael also began gathering his magical energy, hoping he could succeed, even just once, in this mission. In the end, the students managed to defeat all 50 monsters, and Chris expressed his deep admiration for the group's performance, affirming that such a result was to be expected from main characters and their companions in the story. Then Chris recalled the situation and began to smile nervously as he faced the massive monster standing right in front of him. The giant rabbit stared at him with a terrifying, hungry gaze, while Chris felt helpless and afraid. He thought to himself that he would have preferred to pass out before feeling any pain, as he suddenly remembered that the monster was still there. But he quickly regained his composure and realized that giving up was not an option. If he failed his mission, he would certainly die. He decided it was better to fight and try to survive than to surrender to death so easily. Meanwhile, Michael was fighting the smaller monsters with all his might, but suddenly stopped when he noticed Chris's dire situation. Michael screamed in panic when he realized the teacher's life was in real danger. He ran toward Chris in a state of panic, repeating that what he was seeing in front of him was impossible. He burst into tears upon seeing Chris under attack, remembering painful moments and believing someone else had died because of him again. Michael began blaming himself harshly, believing his weakness was the reason he couldn't defeat a single monster or save his teacher. He reached out his hand, asking himself if it was truly his fault. Belle tried to stop him from getting closer to the danger, but he shouted loudly for her to let him go because the teacher was still in danger. But Belle, deeply saddened, told him it was already too late, assuring him that the teacher had sacrificed himself for them and that the monster had slowed down from being full. Michael refused to believe Belle's words and kept repeating that it couldn't be true. He grabbed Belle, desperately telling her that she could use healing magic to save the teacher. But Belle sadly apologized to Michael, saying she couldn't do that, leaving him in a state of deep shock. The scene shifted to a past moment between Michael and Chris, when Michael had asked Chris to help him become stronger. At the time, Michael had admitted honestly that he knew he had no right to ask, but he truly wanted to become strong. Michael told Chris he wanted the strength to take responsibility on his own. Despite his fear that Chris might laugh at him, he assured him he was willing to do anything to make it happen. Chris responded calmly and confidently, telling Michael that he would indeed become strong. In that moment, Michael felt a deep connection with Chris, who was the only one who ever believed in him, and told him he could be strong. Meanwhile, Dulcie was screaming bravely, encouraging the other students to fight and not to wait for help. Michael began to feel determined and wanted to give it his all in this battle. At the same time, Nika took the initiative and launched a powerful offensive spell, rallying everyone. Even so, Michael continued to feel guilty, thinking he was nothing but a burden and that it would have been better if he had been eaten instead of the teacher. Belle tried to calm Michael down and urged him to run away with her quickly, but he kept crying and couldn't control his emotions. Michael wished for death upon himself instead of the teacher or his mother, crying intensely with his face buried in his hands. In that critical moment, a mysterious voice whispered to Michael, telling him that if he truly desired strength, he had to take its hand and become one with it. Michael began to give in to that voice, believing that he was the one who should have died. But suddenly, something strange happened. Michael felt something that snapped him out of his desperate state. Everyone heard a powerful voice ordering them to stop immediately. Chris suddenly appeared, standing confidently after defeating the monster, sarcastically asking why the students were trying to run away while so many monsters were still left. Finally, a message appeared before Chris confirming that 27 out of 50 monsters had been defeated, meaning their great success in the mission was drawing near.